post-pandemic, we're kind of post-pandemic, I suppose, but it's where Ffoton is out and about again, talking to photographers, and it's our pleasure to be at Carmarthen School of Art, talking to one of the people who lead the photography team here, or if the person who leads the photography team here, Mr. Huw Alden Davies. And I suppose we should start about some background about you. People may not know you, so it would be nice to have some background about where it all began for you as a photographer.
Where it all began. I've been asked a few times, what gets you going on photography? Where did that all start? And I think it's only musing over it over the last few years. I realised it was a childhood thing. It was a geeky thing I did as a kid. Not the actual taking of photographs, but the looking of photographs, and sort of going through a biscuit tin constantly, day after day, sharing these things with my friends who think I was balmy. Why do they want to see these pictures? Yeah. I should have guessed then that I had, one of those fascinations in photography. But the camera itself took a long time to enter my life, except for, and I did want to bring it along just to show you. I almost forgot this.
Oh, I like seeing cameras.
This is where it all began. Okay, those two things. An SLR, I had no idea what an SLR is, or was. I was a 10-year-old with one of those things going around the street, taking pictures of my friends.
Like Instamatic things.
Yeah, well, it's a 110. It's a Kodak camera.
Right, yeah.
Gemini 110.
Right.
And my mother only had one of these. We came from a council estate, so we didn't have much money growing up. So cameras was not something you were sort of familiar with, should I say. However, photographs, in terms of biscuit tin photographs, I just whipped some of these out. So these are relating to the Scaffold, to the moon.
Right, okay.
Pictures. So this is what I would take out in front of my friends. Imagine myself being 10 years old, bringing my mates around who might want to play games or play with Star Wars figures. I'd whip out the family photo albums or little biscuit tin full of pictures.
Right.
And this continued. This has continued throughout my life in terms of, musing into the backgrounds of now other people. And I don't think it was until I was about 25, say, where I was at a crossroads with other things. I should mention I was more a painter, artist,
right, okay,
and a musician before photography.
So what did you play?
I used to play guitar, rhythm and lead, right. And I also used to write a bit as well. We had a band at the time.
What was it called?
It was actually called Nil by Mouth, which probably would have been. I shouldn't say too much, but it was a good time at the back then.
Cool. So 25. What you talked about at Crossroads. Do you want to talk about that, or do you?
Yeah, I think do you know when you reach that point in your life where you feel a little bit lost? I reached, say, about 24, thinking I was doing any job I could find just to make money. I went to art school in Llanelli for a while. After school for about 2.5 years, and the money sort of lured you away from there, so you took any job that sort of give you the cash, and I think I went down that route for about 4 or 5 years, and then decided, hang on, this is not where I was meant to be going. And then it was that crossroads. It's like, what do? I can play music, I can draw, I can paint. Should I go back to that? And it's the weird thing, and I know this is sort of I think of it as serendipity. Okay, I was sitting there on the beach one day and I fell asleep, and I dreamt that I was taking pictures of the wonderful Kate Moss.
Right.
And it was one of those sort of things, and I woke up and I was like, it felt so real. It was almost like an awakening. So that's what you're meant to do. I have no idea why.
So you had a thing about Kate Moss then?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. It came from somewhere. And that's kind of where it all started. Okay. And I looked into doing a course. This fascination with fashion photography started there and then.
I see, right. Okay, that was the key then.
Yeah, and And I thought I'd give it a shot. It was actually down to doing a music course or a photography course. And I remember applying for this and a music. I came for the interview year first. And I had an interview for music. But once I spoke with EMYR at the time, that was it.
All right, okay.
I was sold. It was a hell of a learning curve, though. Those first 6 months to a year was probably one of the most grueling experiences I've had, because you had no knowledge.
Yes.
You knew how to see, you knew how to look, you knew what you were looking for, but actually taking that picture.
Right,
you know,
okay.
it was...
What photographers at the time, from a fashion point of view, inspired you?
I loved Nick Knight. He was definitely one that sort of I was drawn to due to his colour, and it just the way his technique was just something different compared to all the other guys. You had Richard Ffoton, who I liked. And just the typical stuff at the time, you know, like David Bailey, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, everybody was looking at this stuff. There's probably quite a few over the years that I've been into, but it was those in particular that started the ball rolling.
All right, so you were learning a new technique, learning how to use cameras. Were you working predominantly in the studio doing the fashion stuff?
No, not at all. I don't think I was ever involved in any way, whether it was the studio, whether we were out on location. I just kept the ball in the air, really. I never had any sort of preference. But I have to say that the whole lighting aspect became a big thing of photography. Okay,
so we can spin back then to your days as, presumably you were still messing around with paints.
Yeah.
But we spin back to art college and going, and light obviously is important when it comes to painting. What artists inspired you? Did you span over your knowledge of artists into your fashion work?
No, I'd like to say yes. No, it was very primitive. My sort of experience with artists as a young sort of artist, definitely not. I didn't look enough at those guys back then. I was into your typical sort of painters. Right. Whether it was... Yeah, I think the extent of my sort of experimentation into other artists would have been like Geiger or, you know, those kind of things. However, you know, I still have a soft spot for people like Ed Hopper or even Van Gogh, for instance. When I was younger, that was my primary painter as a kid.
Right, okay. So you did your course.
Yeah.
What happened then?
It was a series of things, really. By the time I got to the second year of my degree, I knew this was it. There was something that I was like, I'd never felt so passionate about something like this before. I'd been into music. Yes, I was passionate about that, but this was different.
Yeah.
I had a passion for cinema. This was different.
Right.
There was something special about it. And by the time I got to the second year, I strived. I constantly strived. I was constantly with the camera, constantly working out light, working out subjects, how people did things. And I spent about 2 years trying to work out that process. And I think I found myself. And it took me until the sort of like halfway through the third year where I'd spent enough time with it to know what I wanted to be and what I could do.
And what did you want to be?
By that stage, it was fashion, music, photography. So those things were coming together. Yeah. But there was also that thing which I couldn't put I couldn't put a name to it at the time, which was fine art photography or documentary. So it's those two things that I've landed in over the last 10 years. Yeah. However,
how would you define fine art photography?
How I would define it, something that you sort of control or create dialogue with. Okay. That would be my... Although, you know, there's a very fine line between any photography, really, in my opinion, these days especially. There's no clear cut on anything. Yeah. And I tend to cross over whatever I'm doing. Okay. But, yeah, the fine art thing for me was, you know, learning the language, the visual language, and how that worked in different camps. Yeah. And that's what I started to discover in that third year when things started to come together. Okay. So, yeah, I did this body of work at the time. which I called Fear and Hoping. And it was based on 7 families, including my own. And I did these portraits that discussed the idea of how the nuclear family worked.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
And I had a sort of series of successes off the back of this, this series. So I think that was when it really, really happened. I knew this was my call and this is what I needed to do.
Right.
Some way or another. I didn't know exactly how it was going to pan out, but that was the beginning.
So when you left college, did you find work as a photographer then?
Yeah. I assisted. I went up to London. I tried to assist anybody I could. I have to say I had a great mentor here at Rick Bauer, who I worked with as an assistant for many years.
Yes, working on his 5/4s and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I tell you what, we had some fantastic times as photographers out on the road, and I was learning, every step of the way from him, from other photographers, from designers, from musicians, artists. We tend to click with them all. You spent a lot of time with them. So you learn your process, you learn your craft through these people.
Yes.
And he was definitely a major role model in my sort of career early days.
Yeah, well, you preempted my question. Another question is who do you, obviously Rick Bauer is one, do you obviously look up to? Are there any other photographers within Wales that have influenced you in any way?
Yeah, massively. Right across the board, I suppose. You can go back now, you can look at some of the masters. I assume, think of David Hearn. I looked a lot upon his work as a younger photographer, so he was definitely in the early stages. You had photographers that come in to teach. I look at them as sort of Welsh photographers. They might disagree. You've got Claire Richardson, who was to come in to teach you. She was a massive sort of influence on my early career.
Yeah.
Again, another major mentor in my photographic career. Mm-hmm. So without those two, I'm not sure where it would have gone in terms of my career direction.
Okay.
But the assisting thing definitely helped me work out, do I want to do this? Do I want to do that? Yes. Should I try this? Let's try that. Yeah. And as you sort of went forward, you whittled these things down and you worked out, hang on, that's where my interest lies.
Yeah.
So it really helped. Yeah.
So assisting, the next step is actually taking the shots. So tell me about the next step.
I think from that stage, I started working on my own projects. So knowing how successful my degree stuff was out there, it had won awards. I think I remember, the photographers around me telling me, it's silly not to sort of carry that forward. You need to be doing those things as well as the other stuff. So I did commercial stuff. I did a lot of freelance. I worked as a wedding photographer, portrait photographer, while doing the editorial stuff.
Right.
So there was a lot of different things constantly. But I started working on the next phase of my documentary projects, which became the Tumble project.
Yeah.
So I did this over a few years. I did have the option to go straight into an MA, and I decided no. In 3 years from my degree, that might be the thing.
Okay.
And exactly 3 years to the date, I joined the MA course in Newport.
Yes.
And this is where I started sort of focusing my work, really, the project work, the personal work. And Tumble became more of a thing, more of a draw, more a point of attention for me at that stage.
Yes.
And the MA helped me focus it. So I was lucky enough to work with people like Martin Parr, Paul Rees, Ian Walker. You had Ken Grant there at the time. I'm trying to remember. Clive Landon. Helen Sear.
Right, okay.
We also had a really excellent sort of program where, lecture program where people come in and help you sort of direct that work.
Yeah, so what did you glean from those names?
I shall give you a little anecdote, shall I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't quite sure. I should say that I wasn't quite sure what I would get out of this process. So when I was there, I would kind of cling at everything and try and absorb as much as I possibly could. These names, and I'm ashamed to say now, back then, I didn't know half these people because I was still trying to find my feet in photography. I knew big names and I knew people in fashion and I knew people in portraiture, but I didn't know anybody in documentary.
Right.
I did know Martin Parr, however. He was my god. That guy, from my second year on a BA photography course right up until then, he was my god.
So what inspired you especially about him?
Just his technique and his sort of brushness. I liked the way this guy could turn a camera, even the way he spoke about it. But I loved the way he could turn a camera at such normal things and make them feel so special. That's the best way I can say it without sort of butter coating it.
Yes.
It just felt, this is different. How can he make something I understand so completely look so different? Right. And that I caught on to. Yeah. And that detail, the way he looks at a subject, and not just the way he composes it or lights it, the way it was so different to everyone else.
Right, okay. So in those sort of you'd gone through a course and now you were thrown into a different world where different thinkers, people who'd done the work, had a body of work. So did you find yourself emulating them in any way?
Not at all. No, I'd already had sort of... I definitely had people I emulated, definitely. It was part of the learning process. And I think the ones that I aspired to creatively or technically were people like Crutzen or Philip Locher de Cossilla or Jeff Wall, possibly, because they were more narrative and I was more in tune with that kind of thing.
All right.
But coming back to that sort of what I was leading up to, the anecdote in terms of I actually sat there with Martin Parr. Like this guy was the closest thing I'd had to. Yes, there were things that I admired about his work, which I would like to have done, but I wasn't that photographer. Yeah. But having sat there with him, I remember him coming in one day out of the blues to do a tutorial, and I was like, I can't be doing this. Right. I can't be sat there in front of Martin Parr showing him this work. How is this going to go down? And I did. I remember about 10 of us sat around a table. Yeah. And there was a lovely young woman who was showing her work at the time. And I just thought it was fantastic. And I thought this is going to go down a dream with Martin Parr because she had that sort of technique. Yeah. And the best way I can say it, he really ripped into her. Oh, right. And you can imagine how that feels when you sat there. Everybody started sort of like stepping back slightly. And I kind of was going further into the corner. I do not want to deal with this. Yeah. I do not need to hear someone that I so admired telling me what my work was or, how well it was working or not working or... Yeah. And then he gave me one of the most sort of glowing sort of reports on what I was doing right, how I should be doing it. And he even told everybody in the classroom at the time, which is it's embarrassing at the same time, but it was such a wonderful feeling to have that come from one of the legends that you looked up to.
Yeah, so what pictures did you show him?
I showed him the Tumble series that I was working on. Right. He did say, I remember him saying, I can't see these, why you were working so small. I only had like thumbnails. Right. So I showed him them on the screen as large and he gave me a glowing tutorial on that, which knocked me back a bit because it's something I never expected. Yeah. But it did something for my confidence massively. I think from there, do you know that fear you have of putting your stuff in front of people? Yeah. And do you know that thing, what's the worst that could happen? Well, the worst had happened and didn't go the way I expected it. Right. I'd had similar situations, maybe with Paul Rees, where it went totally the other way. Yeah. And there was other photographers who might, have ripped it to pieces and said, go away, start again. Or, but to have someone that you looked up to like that and tell you that it is working, just made me realise that anybody can tell you anything. It's up to you in the end. And I think it gave me that confidence to move forward. Right.
So Newport comes to an end. What next for Huw Alden Davies?
I think that was the was the time for working things out. I think it took a while, really. I needed some time out after the MA. The MA sort of like pushed me forward. I ticked away at it a little bit for the next year or so.
Okay.
And then something happened. And it's all because at the time, I discovered I was going to teach for a while. And for no reason, I just ended up teaching. I think it was 2011. Somebody said, do you want a teaching job? But I'm like, I've got no experience. Well, you'll get the experience on the job. But I'm like, I don't know.
Right.
But I went in head first and I thought, what's the worst could happen?
Right.
So after a year, I discovered it was a pretty tough job, but I loved it. There was something about it that sort of, pushed you, drove you, and it was something that you could give back to younger students. I wasn't sure what I was giving them at that time, but it was working. They responded well to me, and I responded well to them. And then I took on a teaching degree, or PGCE, I should say.
Yes.
Do you know, by the end of that PGC, that was the trigger. It was like I'd been taken away. They'd taken away that 2 years of creativity from me. In that whole time, I was ready to explode. By the second year of that PGCE, it was like everything fell into place, and it was like shot out of the cannon. Then came Scaffold to the Moon, then came a variety of other projects on the back of it. Xennial was ticking away in my head. It's like having that rest from photography for about a year and a half made me realise all the things I needed to do.
Were you not, since you'd, obviously impressed, from your anecdote, you impressed Mr. Parr, were you not tempted then to go full hog as a photographer rather than becoming a teacher?
At the time, it was full hog. I was doing documentary stuff for the course.
Oh, right, okay.
And I was freelancing, so I was constantly working as a photographer.
Okay.
I was back and forth in London.
Okay.
I was doing, fashion stuff, editorial stuff. I was doing CCQ stuff down here.
Yeah.
And so it was constant. And I think in 2011, when I finished that course, that's when I realised that documentary was my direction.
Right, okay.
It fell into place. I just fell in love with the course. I fell in love with the people I'd met. I fell in love with...
Right.
The things I learned there, I wasn't aware of them.
Yeah, yeah.
The BA course would have given you, elements of that, but it couldn't give you what the MA gave me because it was Newport, because it was like such a dedicated course to documentary.
Yes.
That's when I discovered what it was that I was...
Right. What was the main thing you learnt from that course?
How to... I'm not even sure I can articulate that. I think it was to just stop and observe and to look at things as rather than just a shoot, something that you photographed within the moment. Mm-hmm. It became something a little more sort of condensed, something, concepts, ideas, themes, all these things where, they're things that you dealt with in fashion and editorial at breakneck speed. It didn't give you the option to slow down and think about what were the stories behind these things. Yeah. And that's when I started focusing on my village as a thing, because nobody else was doing that.
Right, okay.
And that was the next step from there. And the teaching thing allowed me, I know maybe this is a cliche, I don't know, or whether it's problematic in any way, but the way I looked at it, and it was kind of like a saving grace. I remember Claire Richardson and I talking, and she was telling me, you want to get a job that's totally unrelated to photography. And I was like, yeah, I'm not sure about that. Right. Because photography, I just found photography. I wasn't about to let it go,
Yeah.
And she said, yeah, trust me, this is how I did it. In order for you to do those projects, you're going to need to let go of that other stuff. So I started thinking about this for a while. I was taking all these wedding jobs on, and I was, I was constantly busy.
Yes.
And it didn't allow you to stop and think about what these personal projects were about.
Okay.
So I took time out from the other stuff, and that's when I started teaching, and I realised this was the unrelated job, but it was still related.
Yeah, yeah.
So I could think photography,
Yeah.
but yet it didn't take up my time, and then I could go away and do my own stuff.
Yeah.
And that's when I found the perfect balance. So it was just a happy accident that those two things came together. Well, you know, maybe they're all happy accidents. I'm sure that everybody will tell you that. The best things in your life come together by accident or some kind of lucky streak or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And that was one of my next lucky streaks, just having those two worlds that could operate together but were so far apart. And I could focus on my own thing.
Right. So, talking about your photographic language, where would you, if somebody asked you what here was your photographic language, how would you describe it to them?
Chaotic sometimes. It was very sort of focused to begin with. Intense. It was intense. You know, the thought process behind it. So how I might sort of describe myself in that, or my style, do you think, or way I approach
well, your
it?
thumbprint. Somebody who could look at a picture and say that's a Huw Alden Davies picture.
I'm not sure there is one. Some people would say there is. I've heard somebody say, well, it was Rick that summed this up the other day. He kind of put it down to almost like cinematic or directed style photography, which is probably true in many respects.
Yeah, you like to use the lights.
Yeah. So, you know, that has definitely been my style throughout. But I've tried to let go of this a little bit over recent years.
Right.
Not because I'm not interested in it, not because I'm not someone who likes to be tied to one thing. I like to explore different avenues, any kind of thing that can create a dialogue or make us think or sort of play with our imagination a bit.
Okay.
That's me. And I think any medium that can allow me to do that, that's what I want to do.
Right. So when you were looking at the Tumble project, what were you looking for specifically? What narrative were you thinking about when you were conceived that project?
That was definitely from a director's point of view. In terms of, I was an absolute cinema nut growing up.
Okay.
I was brought up that way. You know, my mother would draw the curtains, get 3 videos out from the shop, and that was our day. What
was your favourite film?
The one that stays with me to this day has to be E.T., okay? Because I was so young, and it was one of my first influences. Then you had the Gremlins, or you had the Goonies, and all this kind of stuff. And they had massive influence. But as I got older, you know, you started to find, you know, whether it was David Lynch or, you know, some of the more sort of balmy directors. You can think Cronenberg, you can think, you know, right down to the softer stuff. Spielberg was a massive thing for a child. Yeah. That kind of vision, and it did have an impact on future choices in photography.
Right. Yeah.
Lynch especially, again, I think, that narrative, that cinematic lighting, that thing, it definitely had a huge influence on me.
Right.
And I think Tumble became that. When I started looking back on Tumble, it had to be about the way that I saw it growing up.
Okay.
I've got to say, I was a bit of a sort of extrovert as a kid. You know, I was very different, very bouncing off the walls, my huge imagination, you know, a bit of a storyteller.
Yeah.
And, you know, my friends tell me now, do you remember when you told us that? I can't believe I fell for it. You know, there'd be like, these moments. And that's what inspired the whole sort of going back on Tumble and kind of painting it the way I saw it growing up.
Right.
Because I was so involved with all these films, watching these films on a daily basis, it kind of influences the way you see the world.
Yes.
And that's kind of what it's talking about.
Okay, and you've done a lot of live streams from...
Yeah.
What sparked doing live streams?
Again, I think it was just one of those things to just, let's see what happens when you pull at this string or you pull at that string.
Yeah.
I remember having conversations with many people during the time that I started the Scaffold to the Moon or the Prince project. And somebody said, I'd love to see what goes on in that garden. I was like, okay, I've written loads of blogs about it. I've done all these pictures on the stuff. So what's the next step? Live stream.
Right.
Let's do it as it is, as it comes. And at the time I was trying to do a Kickstarter to launch the book, which wasn't very successful at the time, which worked out for the best because I don't think I was ready for it at the time.
Okay.
But that's where the whole live stream thing happened.
Right, okay.
Started,
yeah.
as a promo.
So some people would criticise sort of nostalgia, and they are laced with nostalgia about your school days and things like that.
Yeah.
So how formative and how important was it for you to do those live streams and to recall the bus stop, etc., etc., etc.? How important were they?
Very important. Now, especially, I think once I worked out what live stream was, what it could do, I was interested in how that could communicate with the people that shared these experiences.
Okay.
And it teach me a little bit how different am I to anyone else? And do we all do this thing? Do we look at stuff backward? Do we look at the world backwards?
Yeah.
Because I've done that half my life, more than half my life, all my life.
Yeah.
I look backwards. Everybody says, "Oh, never look backwards, look forwards." And I've found it to be a very fruitful thing for my soul,
Right.
for my mental health to look back and sort of you learn from those experiences.
Yes.
And it's definitely been something that's helped me sort of, make a career out of.
Yeah.
And the whole nostalgia aspect has now become one of the key sort of tones within my sort of research. So,
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I mean, I suppose we sort of pop on into Prince, and I guess this is your dad here, isn't it? There's a picture of you, and is it you?
No, that's my cousin there.
That's your cousin.
You'll see one on the...
Right.
The
What
bike.
sort of motorbike has he got there?
That's a Suzuki. But the first motorbike he brought back was a Husqvarna 250.
Oh, God, I remember those, yeah. Very noisy things.
Yeah, massively. Well, you can imagine the impact that has on you as a kid when somebody brings something like that back.
Yeah.
My father, as far as I was concerned, was a machine driver. He'd never sort of dabbled in motorbikes, and this was his first dabbling.
Right, okay.
And it was just, it was hilarious for us in some respects, and very humiliating for him because he would enter competitions and he would sort of take these out on the track.
Right.
Which never worked out for him. He was never any good on these things, and he'd be dabbling on the track with some very sort of good riders, which would heckle him then because of the...
And there's a lovely shot of him with a side cam on his motorbike. Did you get a ride in the side cam?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Again, that's my uncle's motorbike.
That's your,
but yeah, I could tell you a few stories. But
right. So were you enticed to follow in your father's footsteps and to motorbike?
No, not at all. My parents put me off actually having a motorbike. That's why I don't ride now. I've got a passion for motorbikes. I love motorbikes, but I wouldn't have one.
Right, and there's that picture of your dad with Harley Davidson on the back. Yeah. Did he own a Harley Davidson?
No, he wishes. This is one of the reasons I started documenting him. He's just, what can you say? He's so sort of, backward isn't the right word to use, but he's go with is what we say in Welsh.
Yeah, I understand.
Is when you want to be sort of awkward.
Yes.
It's in his nature.
Right, okay.
So, and this is kind of emblematic of who he is.
Right.
It started, he used to wear these lumberjacks when we were kids, and everybody knew him by the lumberjack jacket he had on his back.
Right.
They were quite popular, but he used to wear them a long time after they weren't popular.
Right.
And we'd be like, oh my God, he's got like about 10 of these in the wardrobe, and he'd have a different one on his back every day.
Yeah.
And we used to mock him and joke, about this whole lumberjack thing. But, water off a duck's back. But then all of a sudden, his cousin brought this jacket, the Harley Davidson thing, back from, I think it was from New Zealand or Australia or Taiwan or somewhere. And it never left his back after this. And from there on, people would start buying him more jackets with Ferrari on, BMW.
Right, okay.
So every time someone would go away, they'd bring another jacket. So this became part of his character. Yeah. He's almost like this, I don't know, like a caricature rather than the person we saw around the house.
Right. Was he, take it your dad is still with us, yeah?
Yeah, yes.
And how would you sum him up? I mean, he comes over as very much as a character, and you talk very lovingly and very empathetically about him and stuff. And the pictures convey that sort of empathy and that sort of bond you have. What sort of bond do you have with him?
As adults, a very good bond. Yeah, we're good pals. Yeah. And I think it helps that we don't live in each other's company. And I think that can be said for any sort of son and father, really.
Yeah.
It was difficult as a kid. I think more on my part because I'm trying to grapple with the world and how it works. And this man, this character, he was He-Man to me as a kid. You know, again, another godlike character who I couldn't suss out.
Right.
So there was that issue with me. And then him being this sort of very awkward person. And I think it was difficult for him because he was always away working and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I always had a big, soft spot for him because he was a hell of a character, still is now. Do you know, whenever I'm in his company, we don't half laugh.
Yeah,
we have really good laughs.
So how did the book come about then?
Just... Again, is elaborating on that. I think I sat there once. He said something like, it was about a little radio. There was a radio sat on the table, and we're having this conversation. And then he goes, that's what I'll do with that. Just out of nowhere, And I'd be like, that's what you'll do with what? That there, the radio. Yeah. What do you mean? He said, I'm going to put it in the glass house between the two sheds. Then I can listen to Chris Needs as I walk from one shed to the other, and I won't miss a thing. And I was like, only you would say that. And it was just these things. And then there was a trigger effect, I think, there. And I'd remember one other thing and remember this thing. And I was like, that's it. You will be a really good project between projects right now, because I wasn't really doing anything at that point other than focusing on Tumble and doing the teaching thing.
Yeah.
And I thought, you'll be a nice sort of like segue, shall we say.
Right,
There's something to sort of work on the side. So I started documenting the things he'd say, which were almost always laugh out things.
Yeah.
Or laugh out loud things, I should say. And then, after a few weeks of sort of documenting things, it became a project. I realised this had to be a thing, but there was one thing that sealed the deal for me. My brother told me, you've got to see this thing he's made in the shed, which was this biscuit tin on the wall.
Right.
So when I went in, I thought, what the hell is this? Yeah. My brother had made a big thing of it now. You've got to see this, you've got to see it. So when I went in there, I could see this tin on the wall, and I'm trying to work it out, and I was like, what the hell is it? Right. And I took the lid off. He's got like 3 little tea lights in there, holes in the top of this tin, and it's directly under the toilet roll.
Right.
In the outhouse now. And I've got this. I'm going home. I went straight home. It's only about 10 minutes up the road. Came back, took the dough off the toilet quietly, positioned my camera, and he caught me in the act.
Right.
And it was like, here we go. This is the moment. And that's where the whole project began.
Right.
And he just went on to tell me, you'll be laughing on the other side of your face when this is making millions. When I'm a millionaire, you'll be laughing on the other side of your face.
Right.
And that's when I decided, no, this is a new direction.
Right. What about the production of the book itself then?
That was a long time in the making. I had all these ideas. I think it began with, once I had an idea this was going to be a project, I just thought I'll just do a little 15-image thing and put it out on the back of a magazine. So I made like a zine type book. Yeah. And that was the idea. It was never meant to be anything more than that. And it worked successfully. It went on the back of a CCQ magazine.
Yes. We
got it out then. The idea of that was to be an exhibition on the back of a magazine.
Right.
So I was always thinking creatively, how can we get people to look at stuff without it, being on the 4 white walls of a gallery?
Yeah.
Not that I disagree with that sort of thing. That has its purpose as well. But yeah, that's when it started. And I thought, okay, so that worked in so many different ways. How else can I make it work? And then I started looking at the photo book as a medium, and how many different ways can this be explored? Uh-huh. And I'm still there. I'm still sort of trying to work out the shape of that thing. From what I've learned, it seems to be the most it's the easiest way to reach your audience, but it's also one of the most permanent sort of options as well for your work.
Yeah. And a publication launched at Diffusion, yeah?
Yeah.
And Elysium Gallery. You have very close contacts with both.
Yes, very much so. They've been massively supportive to my career throughout. To begin with, I think off the back of my MA, David Drake sort of took an interest in what I was doing, and he's supported my work ever since, as much as any gallery can. I'd say he's probably gone beyond so in some cases. He set me up with certain connections and, helped me build a network, whether that's in Germany or, even here in Wales. And we've worked together in terms of like making connections, getting photographers from down this end involved in, say, the many voices that is going on right now. I think the book's been launched today. And Elysium came slightly after with my ties with Dan. They'd opened in 2010. I was aware of them.
Right.
But as a photographer, once I understood the photography was my thing, I remember going to Photo Gallery. And I remember looking at Photo Gallery in Penarth and going, one day, it was my first exhibition I'd seen of this nature. And I was like, one day, that's my goal.
Right.
And that's something I aspired to. And it's something, I got to in the end, and Elysium was the same thing. I recognised it was there 2010. Yeah. And much later, not much later, I think 2013, I started working with Dan, made an exhibition there as well.
And the Diffusion, the exhibition of your work in Diffusion was in the tram shed, because I went to see the exhibition, which is a kind of a nice space to show stuff, actually.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in the way you think about how you edit your photographs. Do you collaborate with anybody and say, look, what do you think of these? What's your style? What's your way of doing?
I'd like to say I collaborate, and I believe in collaboration, and it needs to happen when you're working with something, the definitive thing.
Yes.
But I think it's a very personal process. And it's something that's slow, something that you contemplate for a long time. You come back, right from the beginning, I learned how to edit. I'm not sure how, sequencing, whether it comes... I'm not saying it's a natural thing at all. I think I've watched people do it, and I've understood so much about the visual language and the sequencing of things that I kind of got the gist of the rhythm.
So how do you do it? How do you physically do it?
I would cut out little images, whether there's something like, about 3 inches by 2 inches or something of that nature. I'll lay them out on a table or put them up on a pinboard. And if you've got like 30 or 40 images, or if it continues to grow, like some of the projects I've got, you just start moving them around, taking things out. So you might end up with maybe only 15 images. And then you'll move those things around until you've got the right thing that feels right. But then you've got to think whether it's in a book, whether you're going to see it on a wall, whether you're going to see it in a,
So what is the difference? Do you see that as being different, that the sequencing that you do for a book?
And the way you experience it is definitely different.
Right.
And loads of things can sort of interject with that kind of thing then, like... if you have text, for instance, or if you have graphics, or if there's movement in the pages, or if there's movement, or even in a gallery, that can change massively. If you're working around a corner, let's just say you've got like a few images in your periphery, and then, right behind you, there's something else that interferes with that. Then the way you experience those images has changed dramatically.
So did you make any mistakes during that period?
Always. I still make mistakes. And I think you have to make mistakes, because that's when the happy accidents happen.
Right, okay. Cool.
You can learn from that.
Yeah. And so how is Tumble going at the moment?
I'm ashamed to say I feel more distance from it right now because the whole COVID thing. I've kept my feet in my community always. But this whole COVID thing has definitely distanced me from it. My only interaction with it right now is maybe a run through the village maybe twice a week. Right. That's it. And I rarely see people. So this thing has definitely had an impact on how I work things.
Yeah.
but I hope that it'll get back to normal.
Yeah, so we're collaborating. Mo is one of your students. And he's involved with the carnival thing. Is Peter Finnemore involved as well?
Yeah, I was very interested in... When I decided to do the project itself, it had been on my mind for about 10 years to do a carnival project.
Right.
And it was just... Originally, it was going to be an archive project because the carnival had stopped.
Yes.
Then I started thinking about, what if I do a carnival project throughout the Gwyndraith Valley and document everything together and come up with some sort of definitive book?
Yeah.
And then eventually, something happened with the carnival project. The carnival was coming back to Tumble, and I thought, well, this is it. This is the moment.
Yes.
And I started planning how I was going to do this, and I thought... I'd just come off the back of a collaboration project with Daniel Staveley, where we were doing sort of silver processes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, interesting stuff actually, yeah.
Where we had such a great bond through that project that it taught me so much. I was very exclusively a one-man band before that, and I always made a point of saying so.
Right.
I didn't work with others because I couldn't control others. I needed the control, and everything about my work is about that.
Right.
And this taught me to let go. This relationship with him, that bond in that project, taught me to let go and trust other people and how to work with other people.
Right.
And that influenced the Carnival project. And that's when I invited Mo. He was a student with us at one time, but I recognised how, he's such a good photographer.
Yeah.
And increasingly so, he's becoming better and better as he gets along.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of what he does. And it was, because he's Welsh-based, I was interested to see all these different dynamics come together.
Of course.
All these different photographers, whether they're international, whether they're, outsiders, insiders, all this kind of stuff. How would that affect how we look at this village?
Yeah.
That was kind of the premise of it, but it was nothing more than that.
Yeah.
Until after the first year, I started seeing a pattern. Then the second year produced something, and then the third year, and I thought, this has something I can talk about. So it's become part of my PhD now, as looking at the Gwyndraith Valley, and hopefully this year or next year it'll be a publication as well. Okay. So incorporating all these wonderful photographers, different visions, on one community, small community in the Gwyndraith Valley.
Yeah. Tumble, the only... Because I was brought up in Llandeilo, and we used to come to play Tumble in rugby, which was a very difficult time, to say the least. Playing Tumble was one of the most horrendous things ever. You ended up being black and blue, basically. And so... what it's strange, isn't it? Because you have the same dynamic happening I lived in Llantrisant for a long time, and you have the same dynamic between Llantrisant and Byddau. So where does Tumble fit into this area? I mean, do you go to Llanelli? I mean, would you go to Llanelli? Would you go to Ammanford? Why is Tumble so special? What makes Tumble, spark things off in your imagination?
Too many things there really to draw upon. My idea of it now, or maybe if I look back to my younger days, it was a rugby mining town, wasn't it? That's Tumble. Yeah. And it's a hard town, and it's never given up that reputation, even now. And people tell me these stories, for instance, even it's only within the last few months where they've had experiences, in recent years, and I'm like, it's still keeping up its traditions and its, the way it's looked upon, and it doesn't want to let that go, whether it's up to the community or not. It's just the way it goes. I think being before it was a mining town, it was a farming sort of village.
Yeah, yes.
So it's always had its hardships.
Yes.
And that came, you work hard, you play hard. And that's exactly what they did, what they're doing now. And that's never changed. Yeah. And it still has that kind of resilience.
Yeah. What about the people within? I mean, you're doing the Carnival project, and you've done your dad, but what about other people within the village community that you
characters, absolute characters. We run the local workingmen's club
Right.
Well, my parents did for about 6-7 years.
Right.
And we were very much embedded in the sort of pub culture, you know,
Yeah,
right from that high
Yeah.
into my adulthood. And the characters I've seen over the years, I wish I'd recorded them. It's been filled with such wonderful, wonderful characters.
Yeah.
And half of them have gone. Sad to say, I never photographed them. But I didn't have that sort of ability then, or that sort of inclination. But it's still there. I think it's still there. People tell me all the time, oh, it's not the same anymore. And I speak to people my age, you know, it's not the same anymore. There's loads of people moved in, lots of people gone, you know,
Yes.
and you don't know the next person, you know, your next door neighbour.
Yeah.
I don't think it's there yet, but it's definitely going that way by the looks of things.
Yeah, so the dynamic of the village is changing rapidly.
And I think that was my fear when I started photographing Tumble,
Right,
and that's
okay.
what the visual sort of language is about. My fears and my sort of grappling with letting go of that community that means so much, that nostalgic power and that.
Right, okay.
And I was witnessing, you know, things coming down. We lost the factory, we lost the bakery, we lost the stores.
Yes.
All these things were being knocked down. Even the Tumble Hotel, which you know had been there for 200 years, was knocked down. And it's like, how does this go? This is our history, our heritage.
Yeah.
And this thing was disappearing in front of me.
Yeah.
And that sort of. That made you get up out of your seat and sort of start pointing the camera and sort of questioning these things.
Right, okay. So we're talking long-term project here. Are we talking a Peter Finnemore 33-year project?
Well, yeah, possibly. I tell you what, in all its sort of incarnations, it is now, 16 years long?
Yes.
It comes in different forms. I've already given this an idea. I think 5 years ago, I came up with this idea. As far as I'm concerned, everybody was looking into the valleys. Everybody was looking to the east.
Yes.
And nobody gave this place any sort of recognition in any shape or form as far as... And, you know, the heritage we have in terms of literacy or literature, should say, or even photography and art, there's very little of it.
Yes.
And I thought, well, I don't want this community to go into the dust without it ever being recorded.
Uh-huh.
So that became my thing, and I decided about maybe 5 or more years ago that this should be a large, lifelong project of some kind.
Okay.
So I started pulling at like all strings to see how many dynamics that could give us.
Yeah.
So it began with maybe looking at those 7 families to begin with, straight onto the Tumble project, which was looking at it as a peripheral thing.
Yeah.
Then I focused inwards towards my father, which was one of its central characters.
Yeah.
And now I'm going back in time. I'm going to discuss like a 1980s era or a generation which were dealing with that change.
Yeah.
You know, coming away from the coal mining era into the computer age. I mean, we were the children dumped in the crack of that.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it? Where's that story gone?
Yeah.
Where's the documentation of that era?
Yeah.
So these are things I'm kind of playing with.
Right.